Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Well, thank you, Bob Kincaid. It's a wonderful, it's great to hear your voice. We've had Agnes for a number of programs, consecutive programs, and it's nice to hear your voice. And I know you kind of do 15 hours a week in the evening, so your voice is on the Head On Radio Network a lot, but I don't get a chance as much as I'd like to chat with you. So we had a good chat before we came on the air today. Welcome to this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 19th day of December in the year 2018. We're getting very close to Christmas. We're within a week now. Today is our last program for a while because obviously we don't broadcast to the end of the week, and with a break coming next week for the holidays, I don't think we'll be back together again until the week after next. So, but today is a special program because we're going to have with us a longtime friend of mine, Kevin Shanley, and I'm going to hold a minute until Kevin's ready to come on. But Bob, is calling him and getting him connected while we do the intro to the program. Kevin and I go all the way back into the 1970s when I went to Richmond in the mid-70s to teach. Kevin was teaching part-time classes at the institution that I went to full-time, and we became friends then. And this was 75 and 76. So Kevin and I go back a long way, and Kevin has had quite a career, and I want to chat a little bit and let him kind of bring you up to date on his background and where he's been and the things he's done and the things he's doing, and then we'll get off into some of the latest things he's doing. Just got the cue from Bob that Kevin is ready to come on. So, Kevin Shanley, how are you?
Bill, I'm wonderful, and it was 1976 that we taught together at J. Sargent Reynolds Community College.
You were at John Tyler and J. Sargent Reynolds both.
That's correct.
Yes.
And 1976 was the same year that Mao Zedong died.
Oh, okay.
Then I went
I wonder if Mao knew that you were waiting in the wings, Kevin.
Probably not. I
Yeah.
probably would have been one of his victims of the Cultural Revolution. Anyway,
right.
I'll give you a little synopsis. Then I went up and taught at Northern Virginia Community College, and through '85, and just through serendipitous, I was invited back to the University at Albany to teach, replacing some people who were mentors of mine who had retired. Right. And what I taught up there of particularly interest to you because it relates to the question I think maybe your audience is interested. How did I get interested in China?
Yes.
I came to China by way of the back door of Vietnam. By that I mean at the University at Albany, I taught both a graduate and undergraduate course, United States and Vietnam, 1945 to 1975. And, of course, we all remember those dark days. But in that time, China, of course, as was the Soviet Union, were both allied with North Vietnam. So as I moved on in that course and then began to travel to Vietnam, always through Hong Kong, and I began to really think, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to know the great influence that China has had on Vietnam, culturally, though they never were able to eradicate the separate identity of the Vietnamese, I said to myself, you got to begin to learn something about China.
Right.
And so that's so I began to take courses in Chinese history at the university, and I also began to, after I retired, I moved from the history department, I moved into the East Asian Studies department of the university, where in addition to courses in China, I had courses in Japan, Korea, and then I moved over into the political science department and began to audit classes in international relations, including classes related to China in the 20th century. So, and more recently, I joined the Asia Society, and 2 years ago, I was asked to join the Asia Society Policy Institute, which is in New York City,
right.
whose president is Kevin Rudd, the 25th Prime Minister of Australia. And essentially what I do for him, I do analysis of what is currently transpiring in China, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia. And also, another thing, too, that may interest your audience, most of my friends are Asian, either former students from Asia that I've had or students that I have met in taking classes both in the history and political science department in Asia. So I get down. I've actually, in effect, I spend a good portion of my time not at home here in Troy, but down to the Asian Society at Park Avenue in New York City. By that I mean I'm down there about maybe 3 days out of every given week. But I would one thing I insisted on when they said, "Do I want the job of joining the Policy Institute?" I said, "Certainly, but I'm not moving to New York City." So we sort of worked that out. Anyway, that sort of fills you in your audience in a little bit, your listeners, as to, and I've written many articles on China, on Vietnam, and the relationship between the two. I'm presently working on a book on Xi Jinping, the chairman of everything in China, even as we speak.
Right.
So I don't think I'll bore, So, Bill,
Kevin, can I ask you? This is another question about you.
Go ahead.
When we were together, on a regular basis.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong, tell me. But you were involved in a project with your former graduate advisor who had passed away, and there was a Feldschrift, I believe it's called.
That's right. Yeah.
And I remember. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I that's one of the things I at the time was very, very impressed with about your background and because it was Reinhold Niebuhr. Am I wrong? Am I right?
No, you're absolutely right. I did my dissertation on Reinhold Niebuhr and German-American relations from 1916 to 1956. And my mentor was Professor Arthur Eckert at the University of Albany, whose field was intellectual history. And one of my fellow graduate students named Chuck Howlett, who also was mentored by Art Eckert, we got together and we collected memories, articles from former students of Art Eckert, and we did what was called a Festbrief at that time.
Festbrief, right, exactly. That's what I remember.
A collection of essays in his honor.
Well, the thing that impressed me, and it's stuck in my mind all of this time, is Reinhold Niebuhr, because you are the one that probably knows more about him than anybody I know. And his reputation and his influence is so incredible that could you just briefly, because I want to get into the China thing, but I also want to take the opportunity, the fact that we've got you and a little bit about Reinhold Niebuhr. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Reinhold Niebuhr was a German American. He was born in Missouri in the 1890s. He came from a family that the household spoke German. His father was a minister, which he would later become, and he went to Yale University and got as he said later, he didn't know how he ever got accepted in their divinity school. but they got a Master's of Divinity. And then he considered going on for a PhD, but he said he wanted relevance. So he went out, and of course he wanted to get back, becoming a minister. So he moved to Detroit, and he took up a ministry there, and he got involved in the early labor movement. He got involved in the early civil rights movement, very early, in Detroit. And then he, Union Theological, and of course he did a lot of writing of articles.
Right.
And he also visited, this is in the 20s and 30s, he went back to Germany. He witnessed and wrote extensively on the rise of National Socialism in Germany. And then he got invited back to teach at Union Theological Seminary in New York City,
Right.
where he spent most of his time. And while he was there, he became so prominent. Oh, and he also was a founder of the Liberal Party in New York State.
Mm-hmm.
He was a founder of the left wing of the Democratic Party called the American for Democratic Action. Some of his fellow members of that was Arthur Schlesinger, Eleanor Roosevelt, and they were very influential on the left. He went through a period of pacifism and socialism too, and he wrestled with the question when the United States was being drawn closer and closer into the European war. That really put a strain on his pacifist beliefs. And also, he was torn between the notion of class warfare and his belief that was necessary, as the Marxist position, but his pacifism. So essentially, he gave up his pacifism. What's very interesting about him in terms of his, and I'll put this in quotes, scholarship, because he never considered himself a scholar. And even though the man who never himself and always admired people who got the PhD, I think he had more PhDs written on his life and his work than many other people in America, in the American history. I always considered I didn't know anything about Reinhold Niebuhr. The topic was suggested to me by Art Eckert, and another thing he did, he was one of the founders of the realist school in international relations, along with people like George Kennan, who George Kennan said Niebuhr was the father of us all, the realist school. Walter Lippmann, Hans Morgenthau, I mentioned George Kennan, and some others. And he was a great believer in the notion of original sin and human nature, which flew in the face at the time of Protestantism. At that time was very progressive, and it's very optimistic, and sort of had turned its back on the whole notion of original sin.
Right.
Of course, you and I as Roman Catholics, that wasn't a strange notion to me at all.
No.
So in his idea of the fallibility of human nature, and he wrote a very good book. In fact, his first book was called Moral Man and the Moral Society, and he essentially argued that while certain individuals could aspire to morality or even self-sacrifice, men collectively and nations, they couldn't do that. Self-interest would always come to the fore, that altruism was not possible among people aggregate. Maybe like Gandhi. He used Gandhi as an example. We would know Martin Luther King, a person who really pushed and lived up to their ideals. But his idea that most human beings
couldn't do that
individually, and nations certainly could not act altruistically. They were driven by their own, quote, self-interest. Oh, I'll stop.
Yeah, but it's interesting because we've been dealing with the exchanges between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and one of the interesting things that we got from that, Kevin, is that same difference existed between Jefferson and Adams. We've been dealing with an exchange of letters on the idea of natural aristocracy between the two of them.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And one of the things that becomes very clear is Jefferson is such an optimist about the ability of the general public to be educated in such a way that they could choose the best people to make
Yeah.
the major decisions for the society and for the nation. And
Mhm.
Adams was a pessimist. He didn't believe that.
Oh, very much so. Very much so.
And and you know, and it's the same kind of thing that you're talking about with Niebuhr. You
Yes.
know, and his realism, if you will, as opposed to the idealism that was really taking hold in Protestantism at the time. It's just there's so much about Reinhold Niebuhr that I knew, and you are the only person I've ever known who really knows this stuff. And I thought, God, this is an opportunity to get this Reinhold Niebuhr
Sure.
stuff on the air, because this whole program is being archived, and it'll be available to anybody who wants it on the internet
Okay.
from here on out.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Terrific.
the fact that we have a segment here on Reinhold Niebuhr is I mean, this is almost free. This is free money. This is, you know, this is
Okay.
great. This
Okay,
is
Bill.
great.
Sure.
Kevin, thank you. And you can make the transition back to China if you want. If you want to continue to go on with Reinhold, by all means, feel
No,
free.
I think you know, the funny thing, Reinhold Niebuhr had a great impact on me, both in my scholarship, but simply in the way I thought. You know, I probably was a very optimistic person. I still tend to be an optimistic person, but I realized that, and Niebuhr introduced, I'm just repeating, that when you talk international relations, well, altruism is not a priority with nations.
Right.
Because the first requirement of every nation, just like of human beings, is to survive, and that's their bottom line. And the whole idea that at the realist school, when they look at international relations, it says it's anarchy out there among the nations, and there's no cop, there's no watchman that they can appeal to sort of create order. Therefore, they create order by balance of power, by shifting alliances. The old notion is today's friend is tomorrow's enemy. Today's enemy is tomorrow's friend. You know, I mean, it's a very much a Darwinian, Hobbesian, maybe that's a better word, Hobbesian world out there. Now, there are people that dispute that, of course. They go back to John Locke, and the human beings are essentially good. Well, it all comes out. The basic question here that inspired Niebuhr, is, are human beings essentially good or essentially evil? Now, we all know that they're a little bit of both. But, so, you know, it's what, and that's what Niebuhr introduced me to in his, the notion of original sin, the idea of human frailty, the idea that human beings individually may be capable of what he called the possible impossibility of acting altruistically. But he says for the normal run of humanity, that's only an aspiration that's rarely ever realized.
Right.
In other words, he said something very interesting, and he once said in an article, if Jesus Christ came back to earth today, he'd be re-crucified.
Wow.
Because
That's
he says
incredible.
most people cannot stand perfection or people who are more perfect than they are. And I thought, I thought of that, I said, that's nonsense. But as I think of it, it's true.
Yeah.
We don't like perfection in other people because it reflects our own imperfections.
Uh-huh. Well, you know, it's interesting because, and I don't mean to take you on a tangent by any means, but much of what you said in the last minute sounds like our current president. I mean, he's saying it's an awful world out there. It's a terrible place out there.
I don't want it. That's a program in and of itself. But let me just say this: Donald Trump is very much cut in that mold. And one of his early mentors in life was Roy Cohn, who you may remember, who was Joe McCarthy's chief hatchet man.
That's right.
And he was an early advisor to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was still trying to make his way out from from Long Island real estate to break the get into New York City. And Roy Cohn's strategy: if somebody attacks you, you double back on them, come right back and attack them.
Right.
And and you see that in Trump. He's a very insecure man. His idea is do unto others before they do unto you, sort of a notion. And that's that's And among people who live in Manhattan, and people, I'll call them the old money, Donald Trump is known as what I'll call a bridge and tunnel person. And that's not meant complimentary. People who come in New York into Manhattan by way of either the bridges or the tunnels, and they're not quite on our level and our standard.
Right. Well, there's a commentator that's frequently on MSNBC, and his name is Donnie Deutsch, and I don't know if you're familiar with that name.
Yeah.
But he's very, very prominent in real estate in New York.
Sure.
And he's made a couple of, in fact, I've seen a couple of videos in the last few days, because he's been on this week with some of the problems that the president is experiencing now with the so-called the walls closing in around him and all this stuff about the Mueller investigation and all the other things, Cohen and Michael Flynn and all of that.
Sure.
And basically, I saw him yesterday, and he made the comment that his experience is that, in New York real estate circles, Donald Trump has always been considered the bottom of the bottom, and the least trustworthy and the most ruthless. And that now the world that he helped create is closing in around him, because it's becoming clear, Deutsch says, what they're dealing with and what's going to have to happen. And so he feels that, that this is but again, we're getting off on a tangent here, I realize, and I don't want to do that. But
let me somebody wants to describe Trump as a rolling tumbleweed of corruption. And the sad thing here, and we'll end it, is the fact that Michael Cohen said that. Here's a guy that believed in him. He's poisoned everyone who's been associated with him, including, it's going to come right down in his whole family. Jared Kushner, Ivanka, they're all tarred.
Yeah. That it appears, Kevin, it appears to be that way. But what really got me into this was the realism idea, because the president continues in one-on-one conversations to get back to the idea of that world out there is a terrible place, and the only way you can maneuver in it is to become terrible yourself, and to swing for the fences and all these other things, and the nation, at least the ideology, or what Lincoln called the creed of this nation, is much more idealistic and much more much more optimistic than that. And I think that's what's causing the angst in people about the president, because he's so different than what we've grown up to believe this nation ought to be.
Well, I agree. Lincoln always mentioned he appealed to the better angels of our nature. That's the quote from one of Lincoln's speeches. I think it was while he was president. Right. But I'll transition, if I may, into China, because
do it.
That's been my focus. And
all right, but I want to thank you for what you've already done, because this is great stuff.
Okay. Well, now in China, and I'll fold Trump into this whole thing in his international policy. First of all, I guess you asked the question. I asked myself the question: is how important is China for the United States?
Right.
Barack Obama, a year or so back, he had an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of the New York Magazine. It didn't all just focus on China, but obviously the question of China came up with Barack Obama. And he essentially said this, that the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century will be the relationship between Beijing and Washington. And whether the 21st century is more peaceful than the century we just left, the 20th century, will largely depend on whether Chinese and the United States are capable of working together, managing friction between them, knowing that there's certain problems that there's no resolution to. I just passed in Taiwan, for example. There are others. But trying to find areas in which we agree on, I call that constructive realism. And by agreeing on these problems, or like climate change, another one, we then build trust between each other and build a foundation of trust, whereby we can move on to greater achievements. See, but let me just say this to you, and this was essentially what I'm describing here was the policy of the United States toward China since Richard Nixon. The idea of bringing China into the global community, helping China develop economically, based on Deng Xiaoping in 78, he's going to reform China in terms of free markets, and China is going. And we did that. Mm-hmm. And we did that. And another two assumptions that were in that play. One, China was going to economically develop, and we know that has taken place gangbusters. But as the Chinese got richer, and this is where we were sort of, they defied our expectations. With that would become political liberalization. China, as Americans have thought of China for centuries, they really want to be, quote, small d Democrats. That hasn't worked out at all.
Yeah.
In fact, under Xi Jinping, since he's come in as the party secretary in 2013, no question about it, he is moving China in terms of liberalization, in the absolute opposite direction. And it was very, very disillusioning to many people in Washington who expected both of these to happen, one which did, and they're connected. As China gets richer, she's going to have a middle class that comes up. They're going to want more goodies, so to speak. And it happened. China's got to bridle it. And like night follows day, day follows night, then you're going to have them demanding more and more democracy, defined as responsible government, a greater freedom of the press, greater secular state, religion allowed to exist. It was terribly, what's the word I'm looking at? It was terribly disillusioning.
Yep.
To a lot of, in fact, I have here a copy of Foreign Affairs recent, and right on the front page, how Washington got China wrong. And this is not any political party bill. This crossed political lines. It was just, and the subtitle or one of the articles in there is entitled "The China Reckoning," quote, how China defied American expectations.
Right.
And so now, go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question about that.
Sure.
Is this an example of the optimism we were talking about earlier? Is it naive?
Absolutely.
Are we naive, or
we are naive?
Do we blame China for this?
Well, here's what happened. When our naivety, and I think about China, was sort of crushed, when we suddenly China was not living up to our expectations. And this is all, in terms of their political liberalization. When that didn't happen, as we expected that it was going, and had so much confidence, we were true believers. When I say we, I mean the policymakers in Washington, continual administration. China was going to become a responsible stakeholder. China was going to agree to participate in the international system, free trade. The whole thing was set up in the 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Bank, free trade. And That was our expectation.
Right.
Then, when that didn't happen, then the second point is, then who's at fault? Well, we were at fault in this sense. I think we were existing, we were we were wishful thinking. I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
And when our wishful thoughts about China did not materialize, blame China. And right now, among public, only about 20% of the people trust China. We've really almost fallen off the other side of the horse. Now, China is no longer considered to be the old China. Their strategic partner is the word they use.
Right.
Now China is defined increasingly in Washington, increasingly across both political parties, as our strategic competitor and potential dangerous enemy.
Right. Right.
There's been a sea change, Bill.
Kevin, is this? It sounds to me very familiar, because it's at the end of World War II. Didn't we feel the same way about the Soviet Union? That Roosevelt wanted the Soviet Union in any kind of an international United Nations agreement after the war.
Bill, yes, we did. Yes, we did. And it's very interesting you bring that up in the sense of Roosevelt's attitude. At one time, Roosevelt thought that the partnership that had been formed against Germany, Britain, England, Britain, the United States, China, of course, is in there, and the Soviet Union, was going to be a launching pad for the post-war world where this harmony would continue.
Right.
But just like Roosevelt, I'm going to say Roosevelt in his last 6 or 7 months of his life, maybe a little longer, he was terribly disillusioned.
Right.
By the actions of the Soviet Union, the violation of the Yalta agreements, increasing control, imposed control of the Soviet Union on the Eastern Satellite Nation. But you're absolutely right. In the American public, during World War II, Joe Stalin's picture was on the Time magazine with a pipe in his mouth, and he was called Uncle Joe.
That's right. And I can remember a ticker tape parade for Fidel Castro in New York City. We were extremely optimistic that we could basically defeat communism by putting them into a position where economic development, by working closely with the West, was so inviting that the Soviets couldn't resist it. And it sounds to me, from what you're saying, like that's exactly the same anticipation we had about China.
Absolutely had the same.
Oh, Kevin!
And there's another thing here too. And this goes into with all of what we're talking about. It's almost in American genes, maybe / DNA. We believe that everybody wants democracy, universal values. These are universal values. They want freedom. They want democracy. They want self-determination. They want economic, well-being. We assume those are universal values.
Right.
China would say, no, they're not universal values. Those are Western values. They are not our values. Mm-hmm. Wow. And you want to say they're right.
Well, it's in other words, we could use a little bit of Reinhold Niebuhr right now. to kind of shake it, because right now we've got Donald Trump trying to shake us back to a more realistic view of the world, but that one scares me. I'm a little bit more comfortable in the grip of Reinhold Niebuhr than I am Donald Trump.
Well, absolutely. But see, if and let me preface this by saying I have no brief at all for Donald Trump. I think he's dangerous, but in terms of foreign policy, he is, in terms of the harder. About 4 weeks ago now, Mike Pence gave a speech at the Hudson Institute right here in New York, in which he lamp-basted China. what Donald Trump is and Mike Pence are just expressing there is the general feeling of hardening attitudes towards China that transcend political parties.
Right.
It's become the new consensus in Washington. Possibly coming out of what I mentioned, they put so much of their faith in China that when China didn't develop up to their expectations, I want to say they fell off the other side of the horse, and now something overreacting to China.
Right. That's where I wanted to ask you this question, and you used the word overreacting. Do you? I'm developing this idea that from what you're saying that maybe we're becoming a little bit more disillusioned than we need to be. In other words, once we give up on China on a working relationship with China, and we begin to act accordingly toward China, is that the end of any hope that we could ever be successful in what we dreamed about? In other words, might that be a mistake?
Well, it could be a mistake in this way. It could become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's what I mean.
I knew that you were getting at that. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about. And then you begin to look at the relationship that Trump has developed with the head of China, Xi Jinping. It's not Xi Jinping. I can't remember his name.
No, it's Xi Jinping. Deng Xiaoping was.
Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping. He started the whole process of economic reform in '70s.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
So I'm just wondering whether, in fact, in this relationship with China, that President Trump is trying to convince the general public is possible. It may not be totally wrong. He may be basically softening this negative attitude that exists in Washington towards China right now. And that may end up being the right way to go.
See, I always try to separate Trump's imbecilities. If you step back and look at Trump's foreign policy towards China, he's simply reflecting a growing consensus among, I'll call the engaged people regarding the question of foreign policy. Most Americans are not engaged with foreign policy.
Right.
There's a knowledgeable and there's an interested segment of our population. I put myself in there. There's people who don't give a fig about foreign. I mean, they don't have time in their life.
Right. Well,
educated. Yeah, go Bill. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's I've heard this numerous times that from all over the world, people from all over the world will say, and it's been in international newspapers, that the American people are the most uninformed people about the world and what's going on in the world than any developed nation in the world.
Oh,
because
no
we basically
no
created the world that we want to be out there, not the one that really is out there.
That's right. No. The only thing I can say to that statement is it's absolutely correct. We have to be in our knowledge of what goes on west of California and east of your old town of Boston. And never mind getting to Africa or the Sub-Sahara or Central Asia.
Right.
I mean, and I don't mean to sound like I'm tooting my own horn here. Don't make me say what I'm saying. But the circles I move in are very well educated. They're an elite on foreign politics in China.
Right.
I mean, but sometimes even when I walk out of some of their meetings, I feel I should go to my hotel room and take a cold shower. Because that optimism is still, they won't give it up. And maybe they should.
Right.
Maybe they should.
Right.
I guess what I'm saying right now, Bill, it's very difficult today to be a friend of China.
Yeah.
China has made it very difficult for their American friends. Yeah. Like me.
Well, now the
because
friends
of
that
their
you
own
have,
action. Well, yeah. now if we could
now
flip
the
this
friends that
over a
you
bit.
have, because my sense is, I mean, I'm getting the sense now from everything you're saying, that you're in touch with a perspective and a point of view that Washington's not in touch with. In other words, you're more knowledgeable about what the so-called elite in the Far East is thinking and planning and saying and hoping than our policymakers are.
Well, it's funny. I haven't see. Well, thank you for the compliment, and I'll plead semi-guilt. But see, what our policymakers don't know, and I wrote an article about this. I have it right in front of me. Engage in China and exercise in naivety and frustration. They don't study history. Anybody who had taken even a cursory look at China, American relations, going all the way back to the 18th century, the missionaries trying to convert them to the China market, the fabulous wealth to be made in China. The missionaries go to save. So none of that worked or didn't work up to our expectations. See, I've never had the same optimism about China because my area is American foreign policy, and I knew about this failure in the fact that China's always frustrated our expectations, whether they be the expectations of merchants, whether they be the expectation of missionaries. All those people went out with these grandiose money to be made in China, and much of it was made. Souls out there to be saved, Christians. All those Christian.
Kevin, do you think that that basically we look at China as if it was part of the I'm going to say undeveloped world, but what I mean is that we look at the China.
They're only thinking of the next political cycle.
Yeah. But
in other words,
it sounds to me like we look at.
Hey, gentlemen, just a quick technical note. The Bluetooth connection with Professor Shanley's phone dropped for a moment there. That's why there's but you're both connected, so do please continue.
Okay. Thank you, Bob.
Let me just give you.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Let me just give you a side example. I'll be very specific about Afghanistan. If we had looked back to what happened to the British in Afghanistan in 1840, I won't go, the disaster. But why are we still in Afghanistan? Because nobody wants the Afghanistan collapse on their watch. No politician wants to be the one who lost Afghanistan. Just like in the 1950s, the big argument was who lost China after 1949. And we all know the recriminations of that. It absolutely traumatized the Democratic Party, the loss of China.
Right.
And the advantage the Republicans could. I'll stop. But see, politicians, people in elective office, they only think in terms of their reelection. They are not long-term thinkers at all. I'm not turned off. I'm not surprised. That's who they are. That's the nature of the beast.
Right.
Yeah, what's going to get me reelected 2 years from now if you're in the House of Representatives, 6 years from now if you're in Congress, or 4 years from now if you're in the White House? That's their measuring stick.
It's interesting because it's the same. It's the same criticism that we have today of corporate America. That they're only looking at short-term bottom lines, and they're not looking at at the long term, and it's having an impact on the market. It's having an impact on investment. It's having an impact on people's retirement funds. It's having an impact on everything. And now what you're saying is foreign policy is operating exactly the same way as the private sector does.
Well, in this sense, there's not a strong, broad educational foundation about American history, let alone its foreign policy.
Right.
I mean, when you think, when I hear some of these congressmen, House of Representative types, come on, I want to just shout at my television, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
No,
You know,
but yeah.
You
It
know,
just
Kevin, I was going
frustrates
to
me
say,
is how
from what
yeah.
you've said, they don't. I mean,
No.
the fact of the matter is, you're right, they don't. And
No, they
and,
don't.
and you know, and it's frightening because they're playing with the future of the world here.
Well, that's true.
You know,
But
and
see,
that's kind of frightening.
Well, see, and another thing, we have this sort of, and I said this built-in DNA, that we got to spread democracy around the world. Well, 3 or 4 questions that immediately come up to my mind. A, do the people that you're spreading democracy, A, want democracy? Yes, they do. Well, that's an assumption. B, let's say they do want. Can they make it work? Well, we hope so. Well, that's not, a hope is not that's an aspiration. It may not be reality.
Right.
Well, and then how, if we have them held free elections, a la Egypt in the Arab Spring there, what about if they elect somebody that we don't like or who hates us, like the Muslim Brotherhood? Oh, never thought of that.
Yeah.
See, we automatically assume that elections are the answer to everything.
Right.
Democracy, everybody. I use this metaphor, Bill, for what it's worth. I look at democracy as a very fragile plant that does not grow in every soil. It needs a lot of attention.
Right.
To quote Tom Friedman here, most of these people, China among them, they have no habits of democracy.
Right. Right.
They don't. China doesn't. They have 5,000 years of emperors, and a Confucian hierarchy and the authority. For example, China doesn't talk about individual rights. They talk about social rights. They don't talk about the individual. They talk about society in groups. I mean, that's just, we come from a premise of individuality and individual rights, which the notion comes out of the Enlightenment. That's it, the idea.
Right. It sure does. Right.
You see, they don't have any exposure to that.
Right.
I mean, I guess it's almost like they're in some ways, even though they're on this planet, in their traditions, in their background, in their history, they're on another planet, China and the West. In fact, I wrote an article on that. Does China and America really understand each other?
Right. Right.
Well, you're talking two separate civilizations. In fact, for the first time since the reign of George III, 18th century, a non-Western, a non-English speaking country, and a non-democracy is seriously challenging the United States for the first time.
Right.
And and I don't want to lay it all on the. I mean, I have no doubt that Xi Jinping, geopolitically, he would like to see the backs of American naval and army forces in East Asia. I have no doubt they want us gone.
Yeah.
They want us gone.
Yeah.
Now, what they make the comparison, Bill, you may find this interesting. They say that area, East Asia, and by the way, according to them, both the East Asian Sea and the South China Sea are Chinese. Period. End of report. That's ours. When are you going to get out of here?
Right.
They say, but when you say, they say, don't you have a little sphere of influence in the Caribbean? They say, why should we be any different? Don't we have a right to have our share of influence in East Asia?
Right.
It is called the South China Sea, after all. And they have militarized those islands that they created, despite all the promises they wouldn't do that. And a quarter of the world's commerce passes through the South and East China Seas,
Right.
including oil tankers. Japan produces no oil. So if somehow China got control of those and cut off the oil to Japan, you might as well turn out the lights in Japan. That's why we have the freedom of navigation. In fact, the Philippines sued them before the International Court of Justice, sued China on the international illegality of those islands they have created and militarized. The International Court handed down the decision that they weren't illegal, totally illegal. They're in violation of the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Did China pay any heed? They just ignored it.
Right. Well, but what that does is
so
speak to that's what I was going to say. That speaks to the reality versus the optimism that we're functioning on. Can I ask a question about
Sure.
about Xi? Because he gives the impression, I get the impression when I watch him in meetings and at international meetings, that he's not only a I get the feeling that he's very wise in terms of the operation of the world. He's not totally from a pro-China background that's operating in a world that he doesn't understand. I get the feeling that he understands us a hell of a lot better than we understand him.
Oh,
am I wrong?
No, your impression, wherever you got, whatever the source of those impressions, are absolutely correct. My mentor, Kevin Rudd, by the way, who speaks Mandarin Chinese, one of the few, he had an interview with Xi Jinping in what was it, February of 2015. And he says he was quite impressed. He conducts all of his conversations without notes. He's deeply steeped in the history of China, most particularly the century of humiliation. This part of Chinese history, 1849, 1949, is seared deeply in his memory, as it is those of the Chinese. He's a deeply committed Communist Party loyalist. He will continue the policies of economic growth because one of the legs of the legitimacy of the Communist Party is what I'll call a full rice bowl for every Chinese. A good, that's
right.
One of the things. But however, in terms of he's very conservative in his social and political liberalization. His main domestic preoccupation beyond China's continued economic growth is, of course, the political survival of him in the Chinese Communist Party. That is their litmus test for everything.
Right.
In other words, if they're trying to decide a policy vis-a-vis the United States, an internal policy vis-a-vis their own people, the first question, is this going to help or hinder our political survival?
Right.
But that hasn't been said. He's very, very popular in China. And he plays the nationalist card very cleverly.
Yeah.
And he's also made quite popular because of his anti-corruption campaign. In fact, his very first address after he became party secretary, he said that corruption in the Chinese Communist Party is, I'll say, an existential threat to us. We have to get rid of it. And but the question other people raise is, that's nice, but is he using his anti-corruption campaign to get rid of his competitors?
Right.
He is chairman of everything.
Yeah, he's chairman of everything is exactly right. But I also, I just get the feeling that all the things that you spoke to just now speak to his power and the potential of his power in China.
Oh,
but at the same time, as he deals with the United States, I just get the feeling that he understands us and where we're coming from much better than we understand him and where he's coming from. I think I get the feeling that he's got the advantage in international affairs with us.
Oh, and he's got another advantage. Now, one thing Deng Xiaoping did, because of Mao and the one-man rule, he put term limits, two consecutive terms limits on being the Chinese president or general secretary. Deng Xiaoping put them in deliberately, and also he also was going to remove lifetime appointments, and he also separated the Communist Party from the government, or tried to put a wall there. Where am I going? Xi Jinping has overturned every one of those things. He's now president at least to 2020. He completely overturned the two-term limit. So effectively, he could be president for life.
For life.
Be president for life. My point
is,
President
Trump was very envious of that.
What's that?
I said President Trump was very envious of that, if you remember.
Oh, absolutely.
And he said basically maybe at some point in time we'll come to the same conclusion, that maybe it's better off if we just keep the same person in power. But
but this speaks to the whole question of long-term goals.
Right.
Our political system, maybe for the good, is a revolving system.
Yeah.
2, 4, or 6 years.
Right.
He has the luxury thinking of long term, because he'll be here long term.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right.
Kevin, I just wanted to say we're approaching an hour.
Okay.
And what I'm wondering is, would you like to take a 5-minute break and kind of pull yourself together and get a little bit of rest, because you've been going for an hour.
Yeah.
And I just think I want you to basically have a chance to have a few minutes to kind of think about where we've gone and where you think we might best go in our second hour. And I trust you for that. So why don't we pause and take a 5-minute break, and we'll have, I know Bob has some music queued up for the interlude, and you and I can just kind of sit back, and I'll think about where you've been, and you think about where you've been, and then we'll make a decision as to what direction we should go in. But I really think you need a break, and our listeners probably do as well.
Okay,
so,
Bill. Now, are you going to call me back, Bill, or I just hang on the call?
No, just stay on. Just stay on. We're only going to break for 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay.
Let me kind of lead into the break by telling our listeners we're completed our first hour with Kevin Shanley, and we're going to give him a break, and we're going to give each of us a break so we can digest a little bit of some of the things that Kevin has told us. Bob is going to give us a little break, 4 or 5 minutes, and everybody get a chance to kind of pull their thoughts together. And then we'll be back for our second hour with Kevin Shanley. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Please stay with us.
now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again, your host, Dr. Bill Obrien, and his guest this afternoon, Professor Kevin Shanley. Dr. Bill, go ahead.
Thank you, Bob. And Kevin, are you there, buddy? Kevin?
The Bluetooth dropped. Give me a second here. Stand by, Dr. Shanley, just 1 second.
Okay.
Technology is the bane of my existence.
Therefore, it's a bane of mine too, Bob.
And so, Professor Shanley, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. Yeah,
great, Kevin. Okay.
Hey, before you guys get back into things, can I just ask a quick question?
Please do.
Sure.
When you hear Donald Trump talking about his interactions with President Xi, he talks about him like they're old pinochle playing buddies, and that they just sit down and that they've got some sort of preordained simpatico, and I have this nagging feeling that one of these days Trump is going to walk out of the room in nothing but his boxer shorts and his socks, because he will have been picked clean by a man far more intelligent than he. Is that way off base?
Well, let me just say this: Xi Jinping is a far better pinochle player than Donald Trump is, and as far as Donald Trump interacting with Xi Jinping, Donald Trump is a person that's always looking for success. He's always looking for negotiations which came out successful for him, coming out of his real estate background. Without blabbering along there, I think your observation is absolutely correct. He is completely out of his league when he interacts with a person like Xi Jinping.
Well, I would expand that. Many Americans are out of their league when they're dealing with China anyway. Even Henry Kissinger said that he says, "I just assume they're smarter than we are." Let's go from there. Well, and if I could go based on that, you mentioned 5,000 years worth of civilization.
That's right.
They were behaving in civilized fashion when our ancestors were still squabbling with the buzzards over what the wolves didn't want.
Yeah.
And that being the case, though, historically there's a pattern of expansion and retraction in Chinese culture. I think, for instance, of when China sent out the treasure fleets in the late 14th and early 15th.
That was under the Ming Dynasty in the 1400s. You're right, and they were some fleets. I'll tell you, China was, even in the Ming Dynasty, was so far ahead of the West technologically speaking. It was just if you look at the size of those fleets that were sent out, piloted by a Muslim eunuch. Their boats were 250 feet long. They had 26 major vessels and 22 major, and they had a force on those boats of 24,000 people.
That's breathtaking in its scope.
Oh, it's totally breathtaking in its scope. And those ships, they had 5 masts. They have watertight bulkheads between sections, something West didn't discover or developed over to the 19th century. They were so far ahead of us, and those explorations went all the way around India, all the way to the west coast of Africa, and they brought back countless animals. They brought back representatives from those countries back to, Beijing, to the Hidden Palace. And it's interesting, in terms of China's control over the other parts of Asia, it was a tributary relationship based on the awe that other people had for Chinese civilization. Tributary. We're going to come bring gifts to them.
Well, and I ask that prefatory to the following.
Sure.
Because by the time the last of the treasure fleets were returning, they were returning to a China that had decided never to go abroad again. So they they'd gone through that expansion and contraction.
Emperor, his name was the Emperor, Emperor Mongol, and he died. The one that had commissioned, and the emperor who followed him, actually, not only did he burn all the ships, he destroyed all the maps that they used, and he made the people, uprooted them 30 miles inland. He made the whole people of the coast so they would never have an interest or a temptation to the sea again. This is just amplifying about to put some specificity into what you said. You're right. No, they just turned their back on the world.
And so, and that's just one example of the expansion and contraction.
Yes, absolutely.
Somewhere in the immediate future, is there some possibility of something like that happening again with China, or are they so thoroughly integrated into the global economy that it's impossible now?
No, in fact, I'll focus on your notion of expansion here. China is economically expanding all over the world. On last night's news hour, China is now, I'm talking about Greenland. Greenland is looking to build 3 new airports. Greenland, think of where it is. China is put a bid already to construct those. They have ports that they have, I think, in the neighborhood of 74 ports that they control all over the world. 74. It's staggering. I mean,
wow.
It's staggering in this sense, the economic imprint. I'm not saying military imprint, don't. But the economic imprint of China around the world is, and they use that economic clout as a leverage to, they have what is called the Belt and Road Initiative.
I was going to ask about that.
Well, and I mean, they are making big strides in the Central Asia, and it's all loaning other countries to improve their infrastructure. Pakistan, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan. In fact, before long, you're going to see a railway all the way from Beijing to Berlin.
Oh.
China's controlled railway from Beijing to Berlin.
But to be abundantly clear-eyed about it, this is not some act of global largesse. This is a means of if you have economic control, you don't necessarily have to worry about the military control, do you?
That's right. And see, but on the other hand, not to make the Chinese 10 foot tall, there's been some blowback against that. Let me give you an example. They also, China, with a great need for oil, they have created oil companies on the west coast of Africa. They brought with them all Chinese workers, their families, naturally, and when they got there on the west coast of Africa, the Chinese lived in their own little enclaves. They didn't get out, and the people in those African countries are asking this question. Are you China turning into the new colonial power? Are you taking all our resources? What are we getting? And see, China never, like Americans would ask the question, well, what about the makeup of the government? Is it democratic? To them, it's purely transactional. But their workers have never integrated socially with the Africans. Chinese are racist, right up front. Extraordinary racist. And they certainly don't like other races, they don't like blacks. Never have. Asians in general don't like blacks. I know that's a broad generalization, but I give you some experiential indications of that. But my only point is, even in the Belt and Road Initiative, some of those countries they're helping, they're saying, well, wait a minute now. Is this financial clout? Is it gonna morph, and we're going to become sort of an adjunct of China here? So there's that element too. A little suspicion of China's motives.
Are they susceptible to the same thing that more liberal democracies are economically in terms of financial collapse? And what happens to all this economic expansion if the world economy goes to ruin?
Well, I'm gonna answer that question, but I'm gonna preface it with this way: there is a great fear in China that Xi Jinping, in terms of China's national debt, it is now creeping way past its gross domestic product. It's eating up more and more of it, and it's gotten beyond its GDP. Thus, is China going to bankrupt itself? And I've talked to some of my Chinese friends. They won't say this, by the way, too publicly, but they look at Xi Jinping's projects, the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're asking, well, wait a minute. Didn't America bankrupt itself in the Cold War? Are we going to do the same thing? I mean, the Chinese are not stupid people. Now, you asked a very good question. What happens if we have another international recession? And by the way, China's economy has begun to slow down in the last 4. At one time, it was strolling along way back at 10%. Then it got down to 7%. Now it's down, predicted for this year, about 6% growth. That's a big worry to them, too, particularly when their economy is slowing. At the same time, they're spending more and more money. And, of course, we Americans know about deficit spending, but I won't go there.
Yeah.
So, no, my only point, your question is very relevant. It's relevant not only to you, it's relevant to the Chinese people. They're asking some of the same questions that you're asking, of course, again, very quietly. And these are debates within the Chinese Politburo, which is 25, and then they have the Standing Committee, the Politburo, of which of 7.
Well,
Chinese economists.
Thank you for letting me kibitz in. I'll let you and Dr. Bill take it back over.
And your name is again?
Oh, I'm Bob.
Bob, it's been great talking with you. Okay. And you've asked some good questions, and you weren't convincing as far as I'm concerned. I enjoyed it. Okay,
hey, listen, Bob's great.
Yeah.
Kevin, I want to pick up on where you were with Bob.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
When you say that many Chinese are worried about, going deeper and deeper into debt and with deficit spending and the rest of it, right. Is there any indication that President Xi is? I just get the feeling that he's probably aware of this. If you are,
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is there any indication that he's taking this seriously, and is this part of the slowdown of the economy? Is he intentionally slowing it down?
No, I would say that the Chinese economy was it was not artificially created. Largely was created by American investment there, but that's another tale for another time. Our enabling of China, in terms of American companies, American technology. Now, I will get back to your question, but now if you want to do business in China, one thing he's forcing American business to do is turn over their technology to China as the price of doing business there.
Right.
But now, to get back to your takeoff point, no, he's aware of it, but he's also sees China as a center and the creator and a participant in a completely new Chinese international order.
Right.
His argument of the Chinese is, and I've heard this from China, when the present international order was created at the end of World War II through the Bretton Woods agreements, free trade, the general agreement on tariffs and trade, the bank, China wasn't a participant in that. And their argument is they want an international system that is better for them. They claim that the present system was created by the West, it was created by the United States for the benefit of the United States, and we have a whole different definition of what's beneficial for China. Well, they set up their own bank, the Asian Investment in Infrastructure. They've set up their own economic policies for the rest of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. They're trying to, and wherever China uses its economic clout as a leverage, to a geopolitical leverage to make other countries sort of get in line. So I guess this is rather, yes, he is aware of it, but Z talks about the Chinese dream. He never really defined what it means, but I think one of the elements of the Chinese dream is the fact that he's going to create a new world that's China-centered.
Right.
But now, I got to qualify that. I think there is no doubt that, and I'm just repeating myself, I apologize, he wants to get the Americans out. He wants to turn his near seas, East Asia Sea, the South China Sea, and generally China as Chinese sphere of influence.
Right.
Their argument should be our sphere of influence. A, you've got one, and B, we are the dominant power.
Right.
Don't we have a right to have a sphere of influence? Even that, another thing that Xi Jinping wants, and this goes back to this notion of a century of humiliation, which I said is he's looking for international respect. Mao Zedong, the first thing he said when he took power in his first speech, China has stood up. 1949. And you know what the Chinese say, the Chinese friends of mine say about America? China is back. Is back. And the rest of the world is going to have to like it.
Yeah.
That's an attitude.
Well, I'm developing.
China is. Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to say, basically, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking of it against the context of President Trump's America First idea.
Yeah.
And I think that chuckle kind of tells me that you know exactly what I'm thinking here.
Sure. It's competing. Go. I'm sorry, though. You go ahead.
Okay. When you first started over an hour ago,
okay.
You started with an interview with Barack Obama.
Yes.
And you quoted Barack Obama saying that the future of the world is going to depend on America's relationship with China.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And where Barack Obama was coming from was America's position in the world before Trump. But now
that's true.
President Trump has taken us in a direction where that world has changed.
Yes.
And China's still playing that game that Barack Obama was responding to, but we're not.
Well, here's the thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Barack Obama was expressing a view in which the consensus in America when Barack Obama was still in power, China is a strategic partner. I keep coming back to China is a stakeholder, international stakeholder. China is, we can work with China. China is vital, all of which is now, and it didn't just start with Trump. I say that. You know my feelings of Trump. But there's been a sea change. I'm just repeating myself in the view of China, partially as a result of China's actions, like in the South China Sea, like in the Taiwan Straits. 1996, Bill Clinton actually sent American warship. We recently sailed an American aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Straits. That's the biggest flashpoint. That's one point that could bring Taiwan could bring the United States and China to war with each other.
Right.
Oh, Bill, may I just interject one thought?
Go ahead. No, you're not interjecting. This is your show.
But there are those who believe. Well, Graham Allison from Harvard. They did a study at Harvard in which they call it the Thucydides trap. Thucydides, as you know, was the historian of the Peloponnese, of how it happened, Sparta, Athens.
Right.
And what he claims brought on the war between was the fear on the part of Sparta as the dominant power, the fear of the rise of Athens as a challenge. At Harvard, they call that the Thucydides trap. In other words, it's almost an inevitable type. They did a study at Harvard of 12 examples, starting with ancient Greece, up through the 20th century Britain and Germany before World. And in 16 studies, in 12 instances, those countries went to war with each other. It's pretty sobering. They call it the transition theory. In other words, and let me just interject this one thing. The Chinese perspective is this. You Americans will never accept being number two. Therefore, American policy is a policy of trying to prevent the rise of China. The American view is, or perspective is, China's trying to steal America's future. And there's the rub. It's two different perspectives. They are convinced, those who think about it, that we are out to thwart them, to prevent their becoming number, because we could never stand being number two. And we'll do anything to prevent China from becoming number one.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm guessing or thinking is that if you take if you take Donald Trump's perspective to its logical conclusion, he's operating in the assumption that there won't be a number one in the world. It's going to be a series of regional power structures in and of themselves. That China's going to dominate Asia, the United States is going to dominate Western civilization. I kind of get the feeling that China's view is that we would never accept being number two. Therefore, we have no choice but to try to control them to keep them down.
That's right. And that's the Chinese view. Yes.
Yeah, and Donald Trump is operating from a different assumption. In other words, he's taken us out of that equation. He's taken us out of that game. And in a sense, what he's done is given a blank check to China to do whatever they want to do, because basically his argument is that we need to pull back and kind of make our own priorities our priority and forget about all of this stuff. And I'm wondering whether, in fact, this is going to be the end.
Bill, you are you are absolutely right. For example, I'll give you his withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Pact. So Hillary, if she would have elected, would have done the same thing. But that's a different story. Is helping China our sort of American first policy. Go into the castle, pull up the moats, or pull up the bridges. Yes, that is really assisted China dramatically.
Right.
In establishing its hegemony. See, and that's where Trump is. No, I mean, I take your point, is that he is his American first policy. But I thought the Trump American first policy is almost a mirror image of Xi Jinping's China first policy.
Right.
And there's Bill. There's a great conundrum. But no, I don't disagree with you at all. Trump's actions have facilitated.
Right.
Made it
we've given them free rein.
Well, not only that, yes, that's true, but it's also undercut the confidence of our allies in our commitment.
And that really makes them vulnerable to what's happening as well.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the feeling among some of our, like in Australia, Tokyo, Taipei. They're scared. Well, where does America stand? They're our allies. How believable is American credibility? How believable is American commitment?
Right.
Ergo, are we going to have? Well, Japan has now just appropriated money to build our first aircraft carrier.
Okay.
Not much.
Not much. They never really believed that they needed that before.
You got it, Bill.
They never believed they needed that before.
That's
and
right.
I'm reading and what I've been focusing on internationally.
Yeah,
and,
okay.
and I think this is my failing, is what's going on in Europe. I'm really interested in this Brexit decision in Great Britain and what's going on in France and in Germany. And I'm wondering that if the entire Western world as we've known it, one by one, piece by piece, is kind of laying down, and China's China First policy is developing into a worldwide perspective.
Oh, yeah, it is.
You mentioned the number of ports that China controls right now throughout the world. And so basically, while everybody's focusing on, the other nations are focusing on what's going on with the United States and where are we going.
Right.
Nobody's paying attention to where China's going. And that's what scares me. I mean, in this kind of a world, there shouldn't be such a thing as a Brexit vote, for God's sake.
I agree with you.
It's too risky.
Yeah, I agree. See, we were both trained as historians, you and I, on Brexit. England has always never considered itself part of the continent. England is an island. They've always looked upon themselves as separate. Witness, they never adopted the euro. Never adopted the euro.
Right.
In other words, looking at it historically, England were British. That says it all. And if anything, in more recent years, their tendency has been to the United States, to Canada, to the Commonwealth.
Right.
England would only get involved in European affairs if they thought their national security was threatened. A la Napoleon, a la Kaiser Wilhelm, a la Hitler. Other than that, if they could stay away, I mean, you can make a very good case the British were very short-sighted. But as I read Brexit, many people in the British Isles, maybe emotionally, said, we are tired of being dictated from Brussels. We're tired of having Brussels lay down economic laws for us and marketing and pricing, immigration. Germany, Angela Merkel, her idea of letting in the immigrants is a wonderful idea, but she brought a poison pill into her country.
Right, she did.
She did.
Kevin,
and we all know, you well know as I, what. Well, it really effectively killed Merkel's political career in Germany.
Right.
Because Bill, these Muslims, A, they're not white. Okay. B, they're not Christian. C, many of them are young and unemployable. And they just, in fact, I remember one of the first incidents when they're, I forget, maybe in Stuttgart, where, and this is a minor thing, where a couple of the Muslim immigrants, they raped 3 German women, right out on the street. Nothing. Do you think that didn't get the attention of the German people and play into the right wing now?
Yeah.
Sure did.
Yeah.
Sure did.
And,
go ahead, Bill. Go ahead.
Just this morning, and this is, and I don't mean to take you away from, because I wanted to, before we end this, and we've got a little bit less than a half hour to go.
Okay.
But the one thing we haven't mentioned yet is Korea, and I mean, because I'm wondering about Korea, given everything you've said about China. But before we get there, I don't want to drop this, because this morning in the New York Times, Tom Friedman's piece.
Oh, very good.
And basically, he was focusing on the Brexit That's part of
Yes,
what he
I
was
know.
focusing on.
You're right.
And
Yeah, sure.
basically, what I took from that is that he was basically pointing out the obvious, and that is that the British people can take as many votes as they want, but the fact of the matter is they can't change where they are.
No, they can't change. You're absolutely right.
And the way their economy is functioning and has developed, they're intimately tied with the European economy, and they can, it doesn't matter how much. What I came away from this article with this idea that they can have all the votes they want, but the fact of the matter is the British people who voted for this, and it was not a big majority, it was a small majority.
Yeah.
Basically believed they were fed, according to Tom Friedman, a bunch of lies, and they really thought that they could get out from under Brussels control, out from under the European Union, but at the same time it wasn't going to cost them anything. They were going to keep all the good stuff. They were just going to get rid of the bad stuff, and that's not realistic. And now basically what we are left with is the only nation in Europe that can hold it together is France, and look what the hell's happening there.
That's right.
So and while all of this is going on, all I'm thinking about is everything you've said about China and about Xi's China First policy and the number of ports around the world that they control, and the fact that we have a president in power who is consciously pulling us back from all of this and letting that happen. And the American people are operating on the assumption all we got to do is vote Donald Trump out in 2020, and we can go back to being the world power that we were before Trump. It's not going to be possible. Well,
you and I, as historians now, Bill, we tried that in the 1930s, did we not? Isolationism or non-intervention. In other words, you can't go into the castle and pull up the bridges over the moat. Getting back to Brexit again, two things about Brexit in terms of the question for Angela Merkel. Is the final agreement for Brexit, is it going to be a hard landing or a soft landing for May? She may not survive this, and you know this as well as I do.
Right.
If the deal is not favorable enough to Great Britain, the Brexit deal, then she's going to have such a revolt within her own party, and certainly from Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader.
Right.
It's not inconceivable that there will be new elections, say March or April.
Right.
In England, triggered by a vote of no confidence in her.
Friedman believes, as I remember from his article this morning, Friedman believes that this Brexit vote has to be overturned. That England's got to that somehow saner heads have to take control in Great Britain and undo this, because this is going to blow the whole European economy and everything about it up, and the people who caused the vote don't even appreciate that.
See, if Tom Friedman was here, if you were on a line with Tom Friedman, if it was a troika, I would say this to Tom. Tom, I 100% agree with you. But then you look at, and you can relate to this, then you look at the British system. The British system, the British people voted. Maybe badly voted. They voted. Are you going to overturn their vote? Parliament going to overturn their vote? Tom, is the Parliament going to say, well, we don't care what the British people voted. They voted to leave.
Right.
The only question is, see, Tom, my point is, I don't think there's going to be a do-over this whole situation.
Okay, that's a good point.
The only thing that's going to be in play here is how good a deal can Theresa May get from Brussels.
Right.
And is that deal going to be good enough? Is it going to be satisfactorily good enough to assuage the anger of A, her own party, and B, the Labor Party in England. She has very serious domestic,
right,
consequences. I mean, there are people around her in her own party that are just snapping at her heels.
Right.
I mean, here's I can almost feel sorry for the woman, and I don't mean that in a condescending way. She's between a rock and a hard.
I feel the same way.
She's between a rock and a hard place. But as far as Tom Friedman's comments about the effect if Brexit isn't reversed, which I don't think it's going to be, then the consequences for the rest of Europe. And what's interesting, it's also going to divide Ireland once again.
Yes, it is.
Northern Ireland will be out of the EU. Southern Ireland, Dublin, Ireland, they'll be still in. So then you have the whole question of the border. Back to the
and then
border.
we have that whole thing firing up again, potentially.
That's right.
And
history is full of unintended consequences and a whole truckload of ironies.
But the fact is that given the fact that while there are a number of forces biting at Theresa May's heels, the same thing is going on with Angela Merkel in Germany, and now the same thing is happening in France to Macron.
You're absolutely correct.
And there doesn't seem to be anybody that can take control of that. And my point is that as long as all of this continues to go on, Xi is going to
be the recipient of that.
Game and there's no defense on the field.
All
he has to do is run any damn play he wants, and it goes all the way.
That's right. I agree with you. But see, again, you and I as historians know that the European Union was always in the sense that it was an economic unit. It was never a political unit. Those countries wouldn't give up their sovereignty.
No.
I remember they talked about a United States of Europe. Pardon me?
They weren't going to become the United States, even though many people believe
precisely, Bill. Precisely. That's right. They weren't. Yeah. And I think that was an illusion on their part, and I think that the fact, the EU was put together essentially by Germany and France. You can look at the history of I won't, you know it as well as I do, but it was never a political union. It was it was an economic union.
Right.
No common, no tariff, free borders, and England at one point. Through the relationship of the Brits to the EU, they only came in reluctantly.
Right, and they never adopted the euro, as you pointed out earlier.
No, they never did.
So even though it was an economic union, Britain kind of held back and said, "Wait, we're not even going to play that game."
That's right. Their identity is English, not European.
Right.
See. I'll tell you a funny story, Bill. When I was living in England, this is when they were talking about building. This was in the 70s, before I was at J. Sargent Reynolds when I lived in here. And at that time, they were talking about a tunnel. And they had this old woman on, asking her, a British woman on, what was her opinion of a tunnel? She said, well, my opinion is if God meant there to be a tunnel, he would have placed it there.
Yeah.
The British didn't want Italians driving around their streets.
No.
They didn't want the French driving around the streets. We're, hail Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. I mean, we're Brits.
Right. Right.
But anyway,
it's interesting because what you've done, and I, at least from my perspective, since you've been here, was what you've talked about with China. You've basically created a similar situation in a way in the Far East. In other words, in the last half an hour or 20 minutes or so, we've looked at the discord that's happening in Europe right now. Yeah. This gets us into the issue of mainly, well, on a smaller scale, Japan. But the issue that I'm thinking about right now is Korea, primarily North Korea. And
Well, okay.
what what's the attitude of Xi and China towards where North Korea is now in terms of its nuclear capabilities and its potential nuclear threat and all the rest of it? We look at it from the perspective of Washington and North Korea, but I'm wondering what the how Xi and the Chinese establishment feels about this.
Well, okay. The Chinese established, first of all, geography being the mother of political science. Pyongyang is much closer to Beijing than it is to Washington. Number one.
Right.
Number two, a very, very real fear on the part of Beijing related to Pyongyang. Fears, I'll say. One, that if North Korea was to implode, there would be a tremendous tidal wave of refugees fleeing out of North Korea, and you know where they're going to end up.
Right.
China is terrified of that possibility. Secondly, another terror in the idea, if that happens, an implosion of North Korea, and therefore South Korea and the United States decide, well, we're going to go in and take advantage of that, and we're going to move up to the Yellow River, there's American troops right on the Yellow River. And we know in 1950 how Mao Zedong replied to American troops in the Yellow River. That's the second fear they have.
Okay.
Third fear, and what really bothers them, is Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un, is an embarrassment to China. He's like the out of control cousin. He worsens relationships with the United States. He puts us in a very difficult position to support him, and because the world fears him, as the United States fears him. What's interesting, I remember a few months ago Trump saying Rocket Man, he's going to get fire and fury. It's the Koreans themselves, Moon and South Korean President, North Korea, they've taken the initiative to repair the relationship between them. Leading, because who would lose most if there was a war in the Korean Peninsula? Where would the battlefield be? They're still Koreans.
Right.
So I always saw that as and it started with the Olympics over there. You know, back was a year or so ago when North Korea sent a team there to observe. Mike Pence was there and scowled the whole time he was there, but that's another point.
Right.
That was the icebreaker. But see, here's the real. See, what we want is out of North Korea a verifiable, irreversible, and complete denuclearization. That's what I do. Verifiable, irreversible, and total denuclearization. The question is this, for them, I'm putting out my point here, is Kim Jong-un ever going to agree with that?
Right.
His nuclear program is what is his security blanket. He saw what happened to Gaddafi. He saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. Gaddafi, when he did give up his nuclear program, he's now the late Gaddafi, isn't he?
Yeah.
So, these are examples that stick in his mind. So my question is North Korea ever going to agree to have a verifiable, complete, irreversible end to his nuclear program? Good luck.
No, I agree. And what I'm wondering is from Xi's point of view.
Yeah.
This relationship or seeming relationship that Trump speaks to with Kim Jong-un. The fact that he sends these wonderful letters to me and we actually love each other. What's China's reaction to that? I mean, what would happen if that was real? What would happen if there was really a relationship between North Korea and Washington D.C. because ultimately wouldn't this threaten China?
Well, I will speak to that question, which is a good one. First of all that balderdash about love letters, that's just a lot of window dressing.
Oh,
the fact is that North Korea, and this is the pressure that China has on North Korea, their 90% of their oil, roughly above 50%, closer to maybe 70%, they import from China. In other words, Beijing has tremendous economic leverage over Pyongyang. In fact, we've always complained, Washington, that they are not using their economic leverage on Pyongyang to the degree we think they should to help us.
Right.
Hey, I got to be honest. China has given us tremendous help with. And it's very interesting that back a few months ago, for the first time in the history of a North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, actually went outside the country. That's the first time a North Korean leader has ever gone outside North Korea, went to Beijing. First time.
Yeah.
So one has to ask themselves the question, why is he doing that? Because he is trying to mend his fences with the Chinese because he knows which side his bread is buttered on, to use an old cliche.
Okay.
See, and he also gives him international respectability. Right. As his meeting with Trump gives him international respectability.
Exactly. And that's, it's interesting because when I raised the question of North Korea, I remember that. I remember the president of North Korea crossing the border, and for the first time.
Yes.
And it was
done in secret too.
And what I was thinking about was, from China's point of view, the reason China wants to meet with North Korea is because maybe China believes that there's something to what Trump is saying, even though we basically say he's just blowing wind. The fact of the matter is, if China ever believed that there was a real relationship developing between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, this would be a real problem for them potentially, because it could speak to a reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and that in conjunction with the United States, and that would be a problem because Japan's still there, and suddenly this would really be a threat to China's control of the entire region.
Yes, it would be. Absolutely.
My God.
No,
Kevin,
yes, I agree with you. And what's interesting about, if you want to factor Japan in the equation, now Shinzo Abe, related to beginning loss in confidence, Shinzo Abe, I'm going to say about 3 months ago, actually visited China and met with Xi Jinping. But before he did that, he said to the Americans, well, this won't make any change in our relationship.
Yeah.
Again, when we talk about the fear, in other words, Japan's hedging. They're hedging their bets, as is the rest of our allies in Asia, apropos of your early state. They're hedging their bets now.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it because of Trump's American first.
Right.
And pull it out of that area.
Because my thinking is that Abe in Japan and Kim Jong-un in North Korea are basically looking at the situation and uncertain about the United States, because if the United States continues to pull back, then they've got to find a way to get along with China, because China's the big guy again.
Oh, yeah.
So
they do.
They've got to play ball with China if we continue to pull out. And I'm wondering whether Donald Trump is even aware of. I mean, does he know 1/10 of what you know, Kevin?
I don't know that. Probably
No,
not.
I don't know what
But
I don't know what he knows, but
here's another thing, and I because of my boss Kevin Royd, who's an Australian, he puts the point out. I think it's about other countries around Asia. Australia is particularly. They do not want to have to choose between Washington and Beijing.
Right.
They don't want to be put in that position. Australia and China are each other's primary economic partners.
Right.
But Australia, Japan, they're all tied geopolitically with the United States. That's their dilemma. They've got their own dilemmas.
Yeah. My God.
And this is all premised on the fact we don't want to make a choice, and B, we don't think we're going to have to make a choice. Well, I say that's premised on the fact that maybe Washington and Beijing can work out their problems and not force you to make a choice.
That's right. In fact, that's what I was thinking when you were talking. The only way that can happen is if Washington and Beijing are able to reach some sort
That's
of
right.
and that raises the question of the tariff situation.
Yeah, right.
And I'm wondering if this 90-day hiatus on tariff increases is an opportunity, but it's an opportunity to end the trade war, the potential trade war between the United States and China. But more important, from what you've said, it's a 90-day opportunity to make sure that these nations who don't want to have to make a choice end up having to make one.
Well, yes, that's right.
Oh my God!
In other words, their unwillingness and their aspirations about not having to make a choice is based on the fact that Beijing and Washington will turn that 90-day hiatus, make it more permanent between Beijing and Washington in terms of tariffs. But let's hypothesize for one moment. Let's say it does end the tariff war. Let's look on the optimistic side. Still, that's not going to solve the geopolitical problems between China and the U.S., like those militarization of those islands in the South China Sea. And
exactly.
And you and I, who lived through the Vietnam War, it was big our experience. Recently, America is under the table, but on an open sea, sending military help to Vietnam.
Right.
And the American aircraft carrier, the USS Forrestal, are you ready for this? Came into and docked in Cameron Bay.
Oh my God! No,
Would
I didn't know.
Would you ever have believed that would happen?
No, never.
The Vietnamese have always been terrified of the Chinese.
Right.
There's an old saying about among the Vietnamese: "Poor Vietnam, so far from Buddha and so close to China."
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah,
well,
and we haven't.
I mean, China controlled Vietnam, in fact, for 900 years. The whole history of Vietnam has been. Though I should add the caveat: the culture is extremely influenced by China, as is the rest of Asia. But they never lost their identity as a separate people. We are not Chinese.
Kevin, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I got to say that this has been one of the most exhilarating conversations I've had the opportunity to be in years, and I got you to thank for. This has been better than anything I hoped when we first set this up.
Okay.
I mean, this is incredible. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate. Yeah. And I'll be very honest with you. I know don't you somehow you got to find the people who are making policy in Washington. You got to figure out a way that they come and talk to you. Because I think you've got a lot to tell them that they need to know.
Yeah. You know, Mark Twain once said I can live for 2 weeks on a compliment, Bill.
Hey, I mean it, Kevin. Yeah. I'm extremely impressed and extremely grateful for what you've shared with us.
Yes. So does this go into your archives, all this, or what?
This will be if you go to whiterosesociety.org.
Okay.
It's and basically they archive every single program we've ever done.
Good. Hey, I have to ask you, before we is the name Merrill Jensen means a lot to you. Is Merrill still alive?
No, he died in 1983, Kevin.
Okay.
He died in 1983.
All right.
And he's
who was the guy that was when I was there came down? Was it Merrill Jensen you had?
That's John Kaminsky.
Okay.
And he's taken over Jensen's project on the Constitution, on the pulling together all the materials on the Constitution. Right. If you believe it, I just sent him an email last night because I haven't heard from him for over a year, and I just want to make sure that health-wise he's okay.
Okay.
And I haven't heard back from him yet. But Kevin, we're right at the top of the hour. Thank you, my friend.
No problem, Bill. It's been great talking to you, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
You have been great. Thank you, Kevin, and we'll stay in touch.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. This is one you'll probably want to go back and re-listen to several times. I know I do, because I learned so much. My head is just spinning right now, and this turned out to be more than I ever dreamed that it would be. It's been fabulous. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We won't be back together again until after Christmas, so let me express my hope that everybody out there has a Merry Christmas, a wonderful holiday season, and as much time as possible with the people you love the most. Thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and your support of this program. I hope your holiday is great. I look forward to touching base back with you again during the New Year's period. Thank you so very, very much. Have a great day. Thank you.